The fertility clinic smelled like antiseptic and false hope, and Greta had spent too many mornings in that waiting room to pretend otherwise. She was 34, a pediatric nurse who knew exactly what a healthy pregnancy looked like, which made the irony of her situation feel particularly cruel. She understood fetal development in ways most mothers never would. She could read an ultrasound the way other people read the weather. And yet here she was, filling out forms alone while a couple across the room held hands so tightly their knuckles had gone white. Her daughter, Wynne, was 6. Greta had adopted her at birth from a young woman who couldn't keep her, and Wynne was the best thing that had ever happened to her. Messy-haired, loud, obsessed with dinosaurs and strawberry milk. But Wynne had started asking for a baby brother. Not a puppy, not a fish. A baby brother. She'd been very specific about it. So Greta had thought about it. Really thought about it. For a whole year, she'd turned the idea over like a stone, looking at every angle. She was healthy. She had savings. She had a good job at Children's National in D.C. She had her mother nearby in Bethesda, which helped more than she ever admitted out loud. She could do this. She had chosen sperm donation because it was the cleanest path she could see. No complicated co-parenting agreements. No man who might change his mind 3 years in. No emotional wreckage waiting to happen. She would be the only parent this baby ever needed, the same way she was the only parent Wynne needed. She'd spent weeks reviewing profiles. The clinic used a coded numbering system. No full names, no faces, just medical history, education, personality, questionnaires, audio interviews. She'd listened to donor 4417's interview 4 times. He'd talked about his grandmother's garden. He'd said that the thing he valued most in life was loyalty. He'd laughed at his own joke about algebra, then apologized for it. He'd sounded kind, grounded, like someone who showed up. She'd chosen him. The procedure was unremarkable. The first attempt failed. The second attempt, in October, didn't. Greta stood in her bathroom at 6 in the morning, Wynne still asleep down the hall, and watched the second line appear. She sat down on the edge of the bathtub and pressed both hands to her mouth and stayed very still for a long time. It was the kind of happiness that scared her, the kind that felt like something you weren't supposed to trust. She called her mother Patricia. Everyone called her Pat, but Greta never did. And Pat cried on the phone in the way she always cried, trying hard not to and failing completely. Then she drove over in her bathrobe 20 minutes later and made them both scrambled eggs and didn't say anything for a while, which was exactly the right thing to do. Wynne found out 3 days later when Greta sat her down on the couch with the seriousness a 6-year-old deserves. "There's a baby growing inside me," Greta said. Wynne looked at her stomach for a long, evaluating moment. "Is it a brother? We don't know yet. I want a brother. I know. Boys are easier," Wynne said with great authority, having known exactly 2 boys in her life. Her friend Marcus at school and their neighbor's teenage son who mowed the lawn. Greta laughed until her ribs hurt. The pregnancy moved the way pregnancies do. Slowly at first, then suddenly in a rush. By February, she was showing enough that her patients' parents had started asking, and she'd started getting that particular species of unsolicited advice that only pregnant women receive. Her colleague, Britt, who had 3 kids and the energy of someone who had never once slept through the night, brought her ginger candies every Tuesday. Her best friend Lena, who was resolutely child-free and proud of it, showed up with books and wine she wasn't allowed to drink and sat on her couch being horrified and supportive in equal measure. It was Lena who first heard about Callaway and Pierce. Greta didn't follow business news. She worked 12-hour shifts and came home to dinosaur puzzles and bedtime stories and lesson plans she helped Wynne put together for her stuffed animals. She did not read the Financial Times. She did not watch cable news. She listened to the same 3 podcasts on her commute and considered herself reasonably informed about the world. But Lena did follow business news because Lena worked in PR and considered it professional maintenance. She texted Greta on a Wednesday evening, "Have you seen this thing about Callaway and Pierce?" The CEO. Greta was in the middle of making pasta. No. Who were they? Private equity. Huge. The CEO just got indicted. Money laundering, racketeering, the whole thing. Apparently there's a federal investigation that's been going on for 2 years. "That's terrible," Greta typed, meaning it vaguely. What's his name? Griffin Calloway. He's been all over the news for a week. I can't believe you haven't. Greta set her phone face down and stirred the pasta. She heard the name again the next morning on the radio, driving Wynne to school. A news segment. Something about frozen assets and a federal indictment and a grand jury. The anchor mentioned Calloway and Pierce 3 times. She heard the CEO's name once more. Griffin Calloway. She didn't know why it lodged in her mind the way it did. She'd never heard of the man before. She had no reason to care about a white-collar criminal getting indicted in the financial sector. She dropped Wynne off and drove to work and didn't think about it again. The letter came in March, not an email, an actual letter on heavy cream paper with a law firm's letterhead she didn't recognize. Hargrove and Associates, Washington, D.C. She stood at her mailbox in the parking garage of her building and read it twice in the fluorescent light. It was addressed to her by name. It referenced her patient number at the fertility clinic, a number she'd never shared with anyone, a number that was supposed to be protected under federal privacy law. And it asked her, in the careful language that lawyers use when they're trying not to say anything directly, to contact the firm at her earliest convenience regarding a matter of considerable importance. Her hands were completely steady when she folded the letter back into the envelope. She'd learned to keep her hands steady in the NICU. She'd learned that panic was something you moved through, not something that swallowed you. She called the number from her car with the engine off. The person who answered was a woman named Soren, no last name offered. She confirmed that Greta's patient number was correct. She said that the firm represented several clients in a complex legal matter that had recently become federal in scope. She said that Greta had not done anything wrong. She said, and here Greta heard the exact careful weight of each word, that it was important Greta understand the situation she was in before it became public. What situation? Greta said. There was a pause. Your donor, Soren said, was not a clinic patient. Greta didn't say anything. The profile you selected, donor 4417, was created using falsified documentation. The clinic is currently under federal investigation as part of a broader financial fraud case. The man whose biological material you received was not a voluntary donor. He was one of the individuals at the center of the financial investigation. The parking garage was very quiet. She could hear a car alarm somewhere far away. Griffin Calloway, Greta said. Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, said Soren. She drove home. She didn't remember the drive. She picked up Wynne from aftercare and took her to get dinner at the taco place on Wisconsin that Wynne loved, and she sat across from her daughter and watched her methodically construct a taco with the focus of a surgeon. And she thought, my child's biological father is a man being investigated by the federal government for financial crimes. She thought about donor 4417's voice in that audio interview. I value loyalty, most of all. She thought about what loyalty looked like when it was applied to the kind of organization Griffin Calloway apparently ran. She got Wynne to bed and called her mother. Pat arrived inside of 30 minutes. She read the letter. She sat down at the kitchen table and was quiet for a very long time, which was not a thing Pat usually was. Does this mean he can have a claim on the baby? She finally asked. I don't know, Greta said. I need a lawyer. I know a family law attorney. I need a specific kind of lawyer. I need someone who works on cases like this. She didn't fully know what like this meant yet. She was still assembling the shape of it. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark and ran through the facts the way she did when a patient's vitals shifted unexpectedly. Gathering information, establishing baseline, identifying variables. She was pregnant with the biological child of a man she had never met, who was currently facing federal indictment for crimes she didn't fully understand yet. The clinic had falsified documentation. Someone had deliberately inserted this man's profile into a database meant for voluntary donors. This was not an accident. This was not a clerical error. Someone had done this on purpose. The question was who and why. Her attorney's name was Constance Webb, mid-50s, silver hair cut short, the kind of posture you couldn't learn in school. She specialized in cases that sat at the intersection of reproductive law and criminal law, which she told Greta was a narrower Venn diagram than it should be. Constance laid it out over 2 hours in her office off DuPont Circle. The clinic, Meridian Reproductive Services, had been running a secondary operation alongside its legitimate fertility business. Certain profiles in their donor database had been created without the biological donor's knowledge or consent. The individuals selected for these profiles were connected, loosely or directly, to a network of financial interests that were now under federal scrutiny. The investigation was looking at whether the fertility program had been used as a means of establishing untraceable biological connections that could be relevant in inheritance disputes, custody claims, and financial succession cases. "You're telling me this was deliberate," Greta said, "that someone wanted him to have children he didn't know about." "That's one theory," Constance said. "There are others. The investigation is ongoing. Does he know? Mr. Calloway has been made aware that his biological material was used without consent. He is currently cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for—" She paused. "Certain considerations. He's cooperating." Yes, Greta thought about that. A man who ran a private equity firm that prosecutor described as a sophisticated criminal enterprise was now cooperating with the federal government. She had no framework for understanding what kind of man that made him. She had only an audio clip of his voice talking about his grandmother's tomato garden and a genetic profile that said he had no hereditary cardiac conditions. "What are my options?" she said. Constance was very straight about it, which Greta appreciated. She had several options. She could maintain complete anonymity and continue the pregnancy with no formal connection to Calloway or the investigation, though there was some risk that the matter would become public given the scope of the federal case. She could engage proactively with the investigators to ensure her child's future was legally protected. She could seek a formal legal ruling establishing sole parental rights before the birth. Or she could do all three simultaneously, which was what Constance recommended. "And him?" Greta asked. "What does he want?" Constance was quiet for a moment. "He's asked, through his legal team, whether you'd be willing to meet." Greta sat with that. "He doesn't have to know anything about me," she said. "No, he doesn't, but his lawyers know. They know your name and your profession. Nothing else." She drove home through the city in the early dark, past the monuments lit up white against the sky, and felt the baby move for the first time, a flutter, uncertain and unmistakable, like something deciding whether or not to be real. She said no to the meeting. For 3 weeks, she said no. She went to work and cared for her patients and took Wynn to soccer practice on Saturday mornings and tried to locate herself inside a life that felt simultaneously completely normal and completely unrecognizable. She called Lena, who was furious on her behalf in a way that was genuinely comforting. She called Constance every few days. She read everything she could find about Griffin Calloway, which turned out to be considerable. He was 41. He'd grown up in Richmond, Virginia. He had a business degree from Georgetown, an MBA from Wharton. Calloway and Pierce had been founded by his father, who died of a heart attack when Griffin was 29, at which point Griffin had taken over and, according to the federal indictment, expanded its more criminal dimensions significantly. He'd never been married. No children on record. The press described him variously as ruthless, magnetic, the most dangerous man in DC's financial world, and in a profile from 4 years ago, oddly charming if you don't know what he actually does for a living. She found a photo from a gala 2 years ago. He was standing next to a senator whose name she recognized, both of them in black tie, and he was laughing at something. Not performing a laugh, actually laughing, with the slight squint people get when something has genuinely caught them off guard. She closed her laptop. The 4th week, she changed her mind. She told herself it was practical. She needed to understand who this person was before her child was old enough to have questions. She needed to be able to look her son. She'd learned at 20 weeks it was a boy, and Wynn had screamed with joy in the OB's office, in the face someday, and tell him she'd made the best decisions she could with the information she had. She needed to not spend the rest of her life wondering. She told Constance she would meet him once, in a neutral location, with both legal teams present. The meeting was in a conference room in Constance's office building. It was a Thursday afternoon. Greta wore her navy scrubs because she'd come straight from a shift and hadn't wanted to give the impression she'd dressed for this. She was already seated when Griffin Calloway came in. She'd studied his photographs enough that she'd expected to recognize him, but photographs had not captured the way he moved, careful and contained, like someone who had learned very young to take up exactly as much space as he needed, and no more. He was taller than she'd expected. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than sleep. His lawyer sat beside him. Constance sat beside Greta. There were no pleasantries, because no one knew how to open a meeting like this. He looked at her for a moment, not in a calculating way, just in the way that people look when they're trying to understand something that doesn't fit into any existing category. "Thank you for agreeing to this," he said. His voice was the same. She hadn't expected that. The same low, considered cadence as the audio recording. The same careful way of landing on words like he'd thought about them first. "I want to be clear about something," Greta said. "I'm not here to negotiate anything about this child, and nothing in this meeting changes his legal status or my legal rights." "Understood," he said. "I don't want to contest anything. That's not why I asked to meet." "Then why?" He looked at his hands for a second. It was a very human gesture. She noticed it. "Because I need to understand what was done," he said, "and I thought you might be the only other person in this situation who actually wants to understand it and not just manage it." That was a more honest answer than she'd expected. She asked him what he knew about how his profile had ended up in the clinic's database. He told her, flatly, with the kind of detachment people use when they've had to repeat something painful enough times that they've gone slightly numb to it, that his former business partner, a man named Desmond Pierce, had orchestrated it, that Pierce had been attempting to establish biological claims through the fertility program that could be used to complicate inheritance arrangements connected to Calloway's family estate, that the federal investigation had uncovered this as a secondary layer of the larger fraud. "He used your DNA without your knowledge," Greta said. "Yes, to create children who could make inheritance claims. That's what the investigators believe." She thought about that. She thought about the profile she'd read. No hereditary cardiac conditions. Personality questionnaire that said he valued loyalty. And she thought about how someone had built a version of this man designed to be chosen. "Were there others?" she asked. "Other women?" He held her gaze. "The investigation has identified 3 other cases. I don't know their details." The room was very quiet. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that doesn't—" He stopped. Started again. "There's nothing I can say that matches what this is. I know that." She believed him. She didn't know what to do with that, believing him, but she did. She went home and made dinner, and helped Wynne with a book report about penguins, and got through the rest of the evening on the particular autopilot that parenthood installs in you. After Wynne was asleep, she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about a man who had been betrayed in a specific and strange way, who was also a man who had run a criminal organization for over a decade, who was also a man whose voice she'd heard talking about his grandmother's garden, and who had said, in that conference room, "There's nothing I can say that matches what this is." Human beings were not simple. She knew this. She worked in pediatric medicine. She had watched parents love their children with fierce, absolute devotion and also make every wrong decision possible. She had watched people be simultaneously good and terrible, careful and reckless, victims and perpetrators of their own catastrophes. She did not forgive Griffin Calloway for what he had done in his professional life. She was not equipped to make that calculation and wasn't sure anyone was. But she also did not think he was the monster the headlines required him to be. She saw him twice more before the baby came. The second time was with Constance and his attorney, finalizing the legal framework. He had voluntarily and permanently waived all parental claims. He had established, without being asked, which was the part that stayed with her, a trust in the baby's name, managed by an independent trustee with no connection to Calloway and Pierce or any of its associates. He asked for nothing in return. He didn't ask for the baby's name. He didn't ask whether she'd thought about what she would tell him when he grew up. She told him the name anyway. She hadn't planned to. It just happened, the way certain things happen. You open your mouth and something comes out that you only understand afterward. "Elliot," she said. His name is going to be Elliot. He nodded slowly. Something moved in his face, brief and unguarded. That's a good name, he said. The third time she saw him was accidental. A Thursday in July, 4 weeks before her due date, at the farmer's market near DuPont Circle. She was there with Wynne, who was conducting a very serious evaluation of the cherry tomatoes, and she looked up and he was standing 12 feet away, looking at the same display of stone fruit she was looking at. He saw her at the same moment. He went very still. She looked at him. He looked at her. Wynne said, "Mama, these are the good ones," holding up a carton of tomatoes without looking up. Greta bought the tomatoes. She didn't say anything to him. He didn't say anything to her. She moved down the market with her daughter and felt, rather than saw, that he watched them go. Elliot was born on August 9th at 7:14 in the morning. He was small and loud and furious about being born, which struck Greta as an excellent start. Wynne held him in the hospital chair with the extreme focus of someone who has been preparing for a responsibility and intends to take it seriously. Pat cried. Lena arrived with flowers and immediately apologized for how loud she was being about the flowers. He had dark hair. He had the particular small-fisted intensity of a person who has already decided the world is going to have to work to keep up with him. She looked at him and thought, "You are mine. Every part of you that matters, you are mine." She thought about the chain of events, the clinic, the fraud, the letter, the conference room, the farmer's market, the tomatoes, that had brought her to this moment, and she understood that she couldn't separate those events from the fact of him, that he existed because something wrong had happened, and that she was not going to spend his entire life making him carry that. It had happened. He was here. Those two things were going to have to coexist. She had not heard from Griffin Calloway since that morning at the market. She did not expect to. Constance had told her the federal case was moving toward resolution. Cooperation agreements, likely a reduced sentence, still years of litigation ahead. She didn't follow it closely. She had made a decision somewhere along the way, not consciously, but in the way you make the decisions that actually matter, that she was not going to organize her life around Griffin Calloway's situation. He was a person in the world. Her son was his biological child. Those facts would always be true. They did not determine what she did next. Wynne, it turned out, had been right. Boys were not exactly easier, but Elliot was specific. He slept in emphatic stretches and woke up with opinions. He grabbed her finger in the hospital and didn't let go for what felt like a very long time. He watched things with a focus that surprised the nurses. "He's going to be a watcher," one of them told Greta, in the approving way that nurses say things when they recognize a fellow professional in a patient's family. She thought about that on the drive home, Pat driving Wynne beside Elliot in the back seat asking him questions he couldn't answer yet, DC moving past the windows in the early morning light. A watcher. She could work with that. She could work with all of it. She had enough material. She had her mother, who had driven over in her bathrobe to make scrambled eggs and cry about good news. She had Lena, who would be horrified and supportive until the end of time. She had Wynne, who had kissed Elliot's forehead in the hospital and said with the tremendous gravity of a 7-year-old, "Don't worry. I know everything." She had this city, which she'd chosen and built a life in, block by block, shift by shift, year by year. She had the work she was good at. She had a daughter who argued with dinosaur facts, and a son who hadn't let go of her finger for 20 minutes. She had the accumulated weight of every decision she'd ever made that had been the right one, and every decision that hadn't, and the understanding that you couldn't always know which was which in the moment. She had enough. Elliot made a small sound in the back seat, not distress, just presence, just the sound of a person reminding the room that he existed. "I hear you," she said. She meant it for him. She meant it for all of them. She kept her hands steady on her lap and watched Washington move past the window, and she thought, "Okay, let's go."